Tracking down the history of one family can be a big project. Now consider doing that for hundreds of families.
One woman is documenting the history of the earliest African Americans to settle in Minnesota, and she's trying to find their descendants who still live here. It's a daunting task, but she wants to make sure the entire African American story is part of the Minnesota story.
There is so much history connected to Fort Snelling. Layers and layers of history stacked up here on the bluffs. Part of that history, slaves from Missouri traveling up the Mississippi on two boats to freedom that docked at Fort Snelling. The local documentary, Longfellow, Our Journey, recognizing the significance of this Minnesota history.
In 1863, the Davenport and Northerner brought more than 500 newly freed, enslaved men, women, and children from the South.
This would be the origin of many African American roots in Minnesota.
The boats docked right here. Their ropes were tied around these very trees.
They came to make permanent lives. They brought their wives and children. They weren't going to be laborers detached from their family after 1863.
Retired Hennepin County Judge Lejeune Lang is researching who they were and who they are connected to in Minnesota. She is tracing their lives and looking for their descendants.
I was able to find a record of the Colored People's Convention that was held in St. Paul in 1869. And that was the list we gave to the genealogists. We have been able to find a significant number, at least a dozen families that connect back to that period.
Robin McGregor is that genealogist.
In this particular project, I started with the names that appeared in this document.
And this document
Yes,
is?
this is the Convention of Colored Citizens, a summary of it.
In 1869, a convention held to celebrate Minnesota giving black men the right to vote.
I created my own little index. Robert Banks was in St. Paul, and he was president of the convention. I also went to the old phone directories, and sometimes their addresses were listed and their occupation. To follow the line, you've got to find the children.
And Judge Lang figures that if the people on this list were here in 1869, they were likely among those who came by boat just 6 years earlier or who served in one of the Army's all-black units at Fort Snelling.
What is it that drives you, and what do you love about this project?
Well, I come from a family of enslavement. On my mother's side, they escaped slavery with the fair-skinned member of the family pretending to be the owner and the darker member pretending to be the slave.
Judge Lang has started the International Leadership Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to this research. As part of her research, she worked to bring out the story of the first black fire captain for the Minneapolis Fire Department. Captain John Cheatham became a Minneapolis firefighter in 1888 and a captain by 1899. He headed up an all-black fire station at Hiawatha and 45th. Cheatham was born in Missouri, likely coming to Minnesota as a child on one of those boats on the Mississippi. Robin McGregor was able to find brothers Ludi and Corey Webster as local descendants, and while they had heard a little bit of his story, this research really connected them to their great-great-great-uncle and the city they still live in. We talked with them about that back in February.
At that time, you know, there were strides being made, if you look back at history, in some equality actually happening. And then, from what I've read in my studies, you know, Jim Crow comes along, and then everything we're starting over again.
Judge Lang's work helped to save the old firehouse and have Minneapolis designated as a historic landmark in 2022.
3, 2, 1,
And the city decided to name a road after Captain Cheatham as well.
We are finding the more the word gets out, more people willing to come forward and talk about their place in history.
Minnesota voted to give black men the right to vote a full 2 years before it was granted in the U.S. Constitution. And that convention in Minnesota in 1869 was a celebration of white and black men at Ingersoll Hall in St. Paul.
It's good to show that we weren't missing as people of African descent in terms of building the state.
Those beginnings, built on the bluffs and stretching far beyond.
And a footnote to this story, as the group from Missouri landed, those steamboats took members of the Dakota who were in a concentration camp at Fort Snelling, and they took them to a reservation. Is one of the many tragedies in our history. As freedom approached for some, it was taken from others. And Fort Snelling has worked to display a lot of that history at the site so people can see the full picture as they walk the grounds there.
You learned a lot there, huh?
There's still so much to learn, too. I mean, last week we profiled a Civil War veteran who's sitting in an unmarked grave, and there are other Civil War veterans of African descent and in unmarked graves across the state, and they're just, they're due a Civil War marker. And a lot of these stories, like the firehouse, it's there. It was not hidden, but it needed to be brought out.
Yeah, it is a rich history that really was kind of buried for really 100 years.
It's not being told enough. Yeah. All right, let's check